They were never meant to be remembered. That's what you need to understand first. Because when 50 children vanish over 2 years from the most celebrated Sunday school in Indiana, and nobody screams, nobody searches, and no newspaper writes their names, something far more powerful than crime is at play. Something systemic, something sacred, something designed to be invisible. In the winter of 1878, a substitute teacher, Margaret Ellen Hartwell, lifted a floorboard in the First Methodist Church of Cedar Creek and saw the truth beneath her feet. Beneath that church, beneath the stained glass windows and trembling choirs, were artifacts no house of God should ever hold. Children's shoes, names carved into stone, then crossed out, clothes folded in ways that only made sense to those who needed them gone, not found. She wasn't supposed to find them. She wasn't even supposed to be there. But fate, or something darker, had other plans. The official records say nothing. The town of Cedar Creek, Indiana, will show you old train lines, mining stories, and proud Methodist roots if you visit today, but it will not show you the names, it will not show you the basement, and it sure as hell won't show you the ledger with 50 initials crossed out in red ink. The truth is this: those children weren't kidnapped in the night. They weren't dragged away screaming. They were handed over willingly by parents who believed they were doing God's will, who believed they were giving their children a better future. And in that lie is the doorway into a secret so blasphemous, so institutionally protected, that even today, nearly 150 years later, it's still whispered in the shadows of church halls and locked archives. You see, this isn't just a story of missing children. This is a story of religious infrastructure turned into machinery, of psychological control cloaked in scripture, of a church that found profit in purity and used trust as currency. You're about to descend into the real Cedar Creek secret, a labyrinth of manipulation, faith, power, and hidden networks. But I'll warn you now, once you see what Margaret Hartwell saw, you won't be able to unsee it. This story won't just horrify you, it will reconfigure how you view institutions of faith, history, and the people you trust most. Ready to continue? Cedar Creek didn't look like a place where children vanished. It looked like every postcard-perfect town in the Protestant Midwest, white church spires piercing winter skies, hymnals echoing through frozen mornings, coal smoke curling above wooden rooftops, everything orderly, everything righteous. But order in places like Cedar Creek was enforced by silence. By 1876, the First Methodist Church was more than a sanctuary. It was the spine of the town's moral authority. The sermons weren't just words. They were commandments. And Sunday school wasn't about coloring books and songs. It was indoctrination, carefully tailored for obedience. The children who attended didn't belong to their families once they stepped inside. They belonged to the program. At the center of it all was Margaret Wilson, 42, stoic, sharp as frost on iron. She'd arrived from Philadelphia with letters of recommendation from influential Methodists, hailed as a reformer of troubled youth. But what they didn't tell you was how many of those troubled children had simply disappeared from records once her programs ended. Her assistant, Sarah Coleman, was the softer face of the operation, gentle, motherly, patient. The kind of woman children instinctively trusted. But beneath that softness was something colder than steel, something that knew exactly which children wouldn't be missed, and why. Together, they orchestrated what appeared to be the most successful religious education program in Indiana. Families traveled miles just to enroll their children. Margaret's name was whispered like a blessing, and when a child was selected for a special educational excursion, it was seen as a divine honor. But the excursions were a myth. There were no archaeology trips, no missionary training programs, no Bible-themed journeys across the state. There were only trains and sealed letters and lies, too comforting for desperate parents to question. The first time it happened, no one raised an eyebrow. A poor German couple's son, chosen for study with a religious scholar in Kentucky. They cried tears of joy. Timothy, age 8, vanished with a packed lunch and a wooden cross around his neck. They never saw him again, but they thanked God for the opportunity Do you understand what kind of mind can engineer that? What kind of darkness cloaks itself in Scripture so completely that parents offer their children to it willingly? This wasn't a crime of impulse. It was a doctrine of disappearance, crafted, rehearsed, and baptized in the language of salvation. And the deeper we go, the more you'll realize. It wasn't just Cedar Creek. It was a network. Every machine needs fuel. For the Cedar Creek system, that fuel was hope. Hope weaponized. Hope injected directly into the veins of working-class parents whose backs were already breaking under the weight of the mines, the railways, and a country pretending to offer them opportunity. You see, hope is a currency, and when men like Robert Hayes enter the picture, they know how to trade in it. Hayes was no preacher. He didn't wear robes or quote scripture. He wore tailored vests, smoked Cuban cigars, and sat on the church board like a king presiding over his subjects. He owned half the town, 3 coal mines, the largest grain elevator, and the general store where every family bought on credit they couldn't repay. But his most valuable investment? The Sunday school. He funded its expansion, sponsored the educational pilgrimages, bought hymnals, pews, even paid to have stained glass imported from Cincinnati. All of it gleaming proof that Cedar Creek was blessed, prosperous, chosen. But prosperity comes with a price, and Hayes didn't spend money without return. Behind closed doors he formed connections, networks, not with clergy but with traffickers. Yes. Traffickers. Men who understood the market for young bodies, for silence, for children whose disappearances could be written off as opportunity. Margaret Wilson and Sarah Coleman were the perfect operatives. They could identify targets under the cover of holiness, gather intimate details through pastoral care, and deliver the chosen ones wrapped in piety and sealed with parental consent. And every time a child left town, Hayes's investments grew, the church grew, and the people, they believed more than ever. Because when a system is working against you, but wears the mask of salvation, you don't rebel, you pray harder. The disappearances weren't seen as vanishings, they were seen as ascensions, and the term, parents who never heard back from their children. They told themselves the letters were coming soon, that silence meant devotion. But here's the part you're not supposed to know. The train logs still exist. Handwritten manifests stored in moldy boxes in a warehouse outside Terre Haute. And on those pages, dozens of names, ages, destinations, 50 of them in total. Each one marked with a letter, not A for arrival, not R for return, but X. 50 children, 50 X's. Each one a mark of silence. A grave with no earth, and we're not done digging. They always start with the quiet ones. The children who don't scream, the ones who don't ask too many questions, the ones who already know how to hide their fear. Timothy Morrison was just the prototype. What came after him was a harvest. By Christmas of 1876, 8 children had vanished from Cedar Creek's Sunday school program, each one hand-picked. Each one from a family unlikely to fight back. Some were immigrants who barely spoke English. Others were the children of widows, women too exhausted to question what looked like divine favor. A few had no living parents at all. They were perfect. And what made it all work wasn't violence, it wasn't force, it was method. Wilson and Coleman didn't operate like predators, they operated like clergy. Every child was chosen through what appeared to be a sacred process, merit, promise, devotion. And every parent was told the same story. Your child is exceptional. Your child has been called. The calling was always for something noble. A missionary journey, a teaching apprenticeship, advanced religious study. The lies were tailored, custom fit for each family's beliefs and needs. If the child was obedient, the narrative focused on leadership. If they were poor, it emphasized opportunity. If the parents were grieving or guilt-ridden, the pitch was redemption. They knew how to read weakness like scripture. And when the child was gone, there was no outcry, no posters, no investigations. Why? Because every parent had consented. They'd signed letters, official-looking documents with seals and scripture. They'd even hosted prayer circles to bless the children on their journey. Cedar Creek became a town that celebrated disappearance. You may wonder, did no one question it? One man did. His name was Edwin Talbot, a blacksmith whose niece was taken under the pretense of missionary training in Illinois. She never wrote. No letters, no signs of life. When he confronted Margaret Wilson publicly, she responded not with fear, but righteous fury. She accused him of faithlessness, of trying to interfere with God's work. And the congregation, they turned on him. The next Sunday, his business was boycotted. His tools were vandalized. He was called a drunk, a devil, a threat to the church. He left town within the month. Because that's how systems like this protect themselves, not with bars, but with belief. And once a town believes in the lie, the truth becomes the heresy. Understand this now. When belief becomes a weapon, the victims never see the blade. The people of Cedar Creek weren't monsters. They were manipulated, programmed, conditioned over years to trust authority, especially when it wore the cross. That's the genius of institutional evil. It doesn't force you. It guides you. It shapes your fears into prayers. It makes you complicit in your own damnation and grateful for it. By early 1877, the disappearances had become more refined. Wilson's operation no longer relied solely on one church. She had begun coordinating with other Methodist congregations across Indiana, Ohio, and Illinois, small towns with fewer questions, desperate families and pastors too flattered by her reputation to notice the pattern. What looked like outreach was actually camouflage, a way to scatter the losses so no single community could see the total. The excursions grew longer, more elaborate, more secretive. Some children were told they were being taken to meet missionaries returning from Africa. Others were promised apprenticeships with Christian publishers in Chicago. Each story was carefully chosen to match what the parents most wanted to believe. And that's what made it unstoppable. Because this wasn't just child trafficking. It was faith laundering. The same way money is cleaned through layers of fake transactions, children were passed through layers of holy-sounding justifications until no one could trace the horror back to its source. Parents weren't just manipulated, they were used to erase their own children. They gave blessings, packed lunches, read scripture aloud as their sons and daughters boarded trains that would never bring them home. And when the letters didn't come, when birthdays passed in silence, the shame was too great to confront, too deeply rooted, so they rationalized. He must be busy with his studies. She is probably helping the missionaries. I should have more faith. It wasn't just the children who disappeared. It was memory itself. The system had learned how to delete people from reality. One girl, Mary Catherine Phillips, was last seen waving from a wagon headed toward the train station. She wore a red shawl, hand-stitched by her mother. Margaret promised she'd return in 6 months, fluent in French and Latin. She never returned. But her mother kept the shawl in a chest for 22 years, prayed beside it, spoke to it, even after the town told her to move on, even after they stopped saying her name. Because deep down, every mother knows, when the church lies, the silence feels holy. You may think, surely someone knew. Surely someone, some official, some pastor, some father with a spine, had to see what was happening beneath the robes and rituals. They did. And they looked away. Because truth is dangerous when it threatens the foundation of your own power. The local sheriff at the time, Walter W. Crane, had received 3 formal inquiries from families who hadn't heard from their children in over a year. Letters that had supposedly been lost in the post. Families were promised follow-ups, investigations, reassurances. None came. Sheriff Crane was a deacon at First Methodist, his wife led the church's women's auxiliary, and his eldest son had just received a job managing one of Robert Hayes's warehouses. Do you think he was going to jeopardize all that over the suspicions of immigrant coal miners and widowed laundresses? Not a chance. He filed the inquiries, marked them pending, and locked them away. But this wasn't just small-town cowardice. This was systemic obedience. You see, the Methodist Church in the 1870s was undergoing a transformation, expanding, consolidating, professionalizing. The competition with Catholics and Lutherans was fierce. The church needed wins, glorious, moral, modern wins. Cedar Creek was one of them. Margaret Wilson's program had been written about in National Methodist newsletters, her reformative genius hailed as a model for rural education. She was even being considered for a supervisory role over multiple counties. To question her was to question everything. And so, when a man named Thomas Bell, an out-of-town reporter who caught wind of the rumors, showed up in Cedar Creek asking questions, he was met not with answers, but with ritual. A church service was held in his honor, prayers said for his soul. Margaret Wilson herself handed him a bound copy of children's letters, obviously fabricated, filled with cheerful descriptions of cities the children had supposedly visited. But Bell wasn't stupid. He left town with more questions than answers. And 3 weeks later, he was found dead, crushed beneath a railcar just outside Lafayette. The local paper called it an accident. Misstep by an out-of-towner unfamiliar with train yards. No autopsy, no follow-up. His notebook was missing. And with it, the last thread that could have unraveled the web. This isn't just about missing children. It's about what happens when institutions protect the lie harder than they protect the innocent. And it's about to get darker. The real question isn't how they did it. It's why no one remembers. 50 children, gone, over 2 years. And today, their names aren't carved into any memorial, no portraits in dusty hallways, no stained glass dedications in honor of the lost. They were erased, intentionally, methodically. Because when memory threatens power, history becomes a weapon. It starts subtly. Attendance ledgers rewritten, last names omitted, excursion rosters lost in a church fire that conveniently spared every other record, family Bibles mysteriously vanishing in the middle of the night. Parents told to grieve privately, so they don't spread fear or sow division in the congregation. And when they did speak up, the church offered its most effective tool, shame. They were told they lacked faith, that they were questioning God's plan, that the children were doing the Lord's work, and they should be grateful. Even grief became a sin, and that sin was punished. One mother, Esther Bauman, stood during a Sunday service and begged to know where her son Caleb had gone. She screamed, cried, asked the pastor point blank why no letters had arrived, why no other children ever returned. The congregation sat silent. Then they rose and began to sing, a hymn, louder and louder, until Esther's sobs were drowned out by voices pretending they weren't complicit. She was escorted out, her home vandalized that night. A cross burned into her front door. She moved away within the week. Some say she lost her mind. Others say she started keeping records. We've never found them. But if they exist, they'd show the pattern. How each child was selected, the forged letters, the real destinations. You see, this wasn't just a spiritual program. It was a pipeline. A network that extended across states, fueled by financial interests, shielded by religious loyalty. And if you think this ended in Cedar Creek, you're not paying attention. Because the same methods, weaponized faith, manufactured opportunity, selective memory, appear in other towns, other denominations, other countries. This was a prototype, a pilot program. And today, we still don't know who funded it, or where the children really went. But we do know this. Every system designed to make you believe blindly, without evidence, without inquiry, is capable of this. And worse. If you've made it this far, you're not like them. You're seeing now. You're remembering. So let's mark this moment. Comment the phrase, "No child forgotten, no silence sacred," twice below. Let the algorithm bury them, not us. The real horror wasn't underground. It wasn't under the floorboards, in the ledgers, or in the missing letters. It was in the eyes of the congregation, and their silence. You see, once a lie becomes sacred, it no longer needs to hide. It thrives in plain sight. And that's what Cedar Creek perfected. Because the most dangerous system isn't the one that uses fear, it's the one that uses devotion. Margaret Wilson was never seen sweating, never seen afraid. Witnesses said she moved through town like a woman carrying God's approval in her pocket. She never rushed, never raised her voice, and no matter how many children vanished, her reputation only grew. Why? Because people needed her lie to be true. They had already invested too much: reputation, money, social standing. To admit the truth would have collapsed the entire hierarchy. Parents would have to admit they handed over their children to a machine built for disappearance. Pastors would have to confess their complicity. Elders would face charges. So instead, they buried the truth beneath ritual. Every Sunday became a performance. New hymns were introduced, focused on sacrifice, obedience, God's mysterious plan. Parents were asked to write public prayers for their missionary children. These were read aloud from the pulpit, solidifying the illusion. The church even installed a plaque honoring the sons and daughters of First Methodist abroad. Not one of those children ever returned, but the plaque still stands, even today. I've seen it, clean brass, recently polished, names etched in delicate script. But here's the detail no one notices. There are 50 names, and no dates, no return, just a phrase beneath the list. They walked in faith, not by sight. Do you understand? This wasn't concealment, it was canonization. They turned the missing into martyrs, ghosts into saints, and in doing so, they protected the system. Because no one questions saints. You can't prosecute memory, you can't indict a hymn. And as long as the lie is sung in harmony, the truth will sound like blasphemy. That's how the operation didn't just survive, it expanded. This was never just about one town, it was a test run. And when you see what came next, you'll realize Cedar Creek was just the first gate. And we're about to step through the second. Let's open that second gate. It wasn't long after Cedar Creek that similar Sunday school expansions began popping up across the Midwest. Different names, same blueprint. Towns like Elkhart, Marseilles and Dayton, places where poverty kissed religion and made obedience taste sweet, started reporting glowing articles in Protestant newsletters. Teachers inspired by Margaret Wilson, new pilgrimage programs, and more children called. But by now, Wilson wasn't just a woman, she was a myth. The church had transformed her into a symbol of religious excellence. She gave lectures, trained new teachers, and behind her smile a system moved like clockwork. Children disappeared. Records vanished. Questions were dismissed. Because by now, it wasn't about one congregation, it was an infrastructure. The most disturbing discovery came from an archived report buried in the Methodist Episcopal Conference minutes of 1880. It described a transport corridor for exceptional youth, designed to share exemplary children with underserved communities and missionary sites. Sounds noble, doesn't it? Until you notice the signatures: Margaret Wilson, Robert Hayes, and a man named Elijah Vellum. Elijah wasn't a preacher. He was a railroad contractor with ties to Chicago's meatpacking district, where child labor was rampant, wages were untraceable, and workers could disappear without record. He oversaw transport logistics for the church's education initiative. That's the phrase they used: transport logistics, not education, not protection, not humanity. Transport. Now ask yourself, what kind of church needs a logistics director? This is the moment you realize Cedar Creek wasn't a crime scene, it was a distribution hub. And as the system scaled, the methodology evolved. Children were now being moved not just across counties but across state lines, sold into labor, camps, domestic servitude, and in the darkest corners, things I won't name aloud. And yet, not one arrest. Not one sermon denouncing the educational abuses, because you can't fight what funds you. The money from these operations didn't vanish. It built new wings on churches, bought new land, sent bishops overseas. Even today, some of the most beloved churches in America owe their foundations to money stained by vanished children. But we don't talk about that, because to question the foundation is to question everything built on top of it, and you're not supposed to do that. Until now, every great lie eventually demands a sacrifice, not just of truth, not just of innocence, but of the one who dares to speak. That's what happened to Margaret Ellen Hartwell, the substitute teacher who lifted that floorboard in 1878 and saw what was never meant to be seen. At first, she did what any decent person would do. She reported it. Not to the sheriff, she already knew that door was locked. She wrote a letter to a Methodist oversight committee in Chicago describing what she'd found beneath the sanctuary. Children's clothing, crude restraints, carved initials, a faint odor of blood and mildew. Her hands shook as she wrote it, the kind of shaking you can't fake. She sent the letter, then she waited. 2 weeks later, a delegation arrived. 3 men. One smiled too much, one never made eye contact, and the third, a thin, gloved man named Alden Brack, asked to see the basement. She took them. They stood in the dark, the lantern casting shadows across the stone and rot. Alden stared in silence, then turned to her and said, "You must have imagined it differently. It wasn't a question." That afternoon she was relieved of duty due to mental exhaustion, given a small sum, escorted to the train station and warned not to return. But Margaret was no fool. She wrote everything down, every name she could recall from the Sunday school rolls, every trip, every family who had lost a child. She even managed to find a rail manifest at a shipping office in Delphi, smuggled it in her coat. Her plan was simple. Deliver it to a Methodist reformer she'd met once in Philadelphia, a man who had expressed concern about the strange quiet surrounding Cedar Creek. But she never made it. Her body was found in a river near Columbus, face down, her wrists marked with rope. The official story? Suicide. The same woman who'd defied an entire congregation, who had written letters with shaking hands and catalogued every sign of horror. Supposedly gave up. Just like that. No inquest. No memorial. Just silence. And her records? Gone. Some say they were burned in a church fireplace that very night. Others believe they still exist, hidden in a private collection guarded by those who still profit from the silence. But you're hearing this now because something slipped, something they didn't erase. And it's only going to get louder.